Late 1943, the North Atlantic. Pitch darkness wraps around the hull of a Liberty ship as it pitches violently in the cold swells. Inside the crammed hold, hundreds of men, veterans of the Afrika Korps, huddle in silence. For weeks they have feared the dull thud of a torpedo, terrified that their own U-boats might send them to the bottom before they reach the enemy shore. Then the order comes to move. They are brought up onto the windswept deck. On the western horizon, a massive golden glow bleeds into the night sky. The prisoners freeze. In Europe, a single lit cigarette could invite a bombing raid. Entire cities sleep in total blackness to survive. Seeing this inferno on the horizon, the men begin to whisper that the city must be burning, that the Luftwaffe has already struck New York. But as the ship cuts closer, the orange haze resolves into sharp geometric grids. It is not fire, it is electricity. They are staring at the unblinking skyline of Manhattan. There are no sirens, no searchlights hunting for bombers, just an endless, defiant ocean of light. In that instant, silence falls over the German ranks. They are not looking at a city. They are looking at the impossible industrial engine of the United States. And for the first time, the soldiers of the Reich realize the war is already lost. To understand the psychological shock of that New York skyline, we must first understand the world the German soldier left behind. By the spring of 1943, the illusion of German invincibility was fracturing, though the propaganda machine in Berlin was spinning faster than ever to hide the cracks. The turning point had arrived in the scorching heat of Tunisia in May 1943. Following the Anglo-American landings during Operation Torch and the relentless pressure from the British 8th Army, the German presence in North Africa collapsed. It was a disaster of a magnitude comparable to Stalingrad, a Tunisgrad, as the grim joke went among the ranks. When General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim finally surrendered the Army Group Africa, over 230,000 Axis soldiers passed into captivity. This created an immediate, catastrophic logistical problem for the Allies. Great Britain, already stretched to the breaking point by years of blockade and rationing, simply could not house or feed 250,000 new mouths. The British Isles were a fortress, but a hungry one. There was no space for vast prison camps, and certainly no surplus food. The solution lay across the ocean. The United States was shipping millions of tons of war material to Britain, tanks, trucks, spam and ammunition on the newly mass-produced Liberty ships. These vessels, crucial lifelines for the Allied war effort, were returning to American ports largely empty, carrying only ballast. The logic was cold and efficient. The Liberty ships would transport the prisoners of war back to the United States. The German soldiers effectively became human ballast for the return trip of the very supply chain that had defeated them. But the men boarding these ships were not the broken, demoralized conscripts of 1945. These were the veterans of the Afrika Korps. They were tanned, disciplined, and politically hardened. Most were young, raised entirely under the Third Reich, their worldviews shaped by a decade of intense indoctrination. They boarded the transport ships with their morale surprisingly intact, viewing their capture not as a final defeat, but as a temporary leave of absence from the war. They fully expected the Wehrmacht to regroup, crush the Allies, and negotiate their release within months. This confidence was bolstered by the narrative Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda ministry had fed them for years. To the average German soldier in 1943, the United States was a degenerate nation, a cultural wasteland paralysed by racial conflict and controlled by Jewish financiers. They had been told that American cities were crumbling slums, that the US military was soft and incompetent, and that the Luftwaffe was actively bombing the American East Coast. There were rumours in the ranks that New York City had been levelled, that the skyscrapers were hollow shells, and that the American populace was starving, rioting, and on the verge of revolution. The German soldier did not fear the American homeland because he did not respect it. He believed he was sailing toward a country on its knees. The journey itself was a harrowing transition. Packed into the holds of the ships, the prisoners experienced the full dominance of Allied sea power. For years they had celebrated the successes of the U-boat wolf packs. Now, locked below decks, they realised the terrifying effectiveness of their own navy. Every creak of the hull, every shift in the engine's rhythm sent waves of panic through the prisoners, who knew better than anyone that a German torpedo did not discriminate between a ship carrying tanks and a ship carrying comrades. Yet, despite the fear, the arrogance remained. They sang marching songs. They maintained rigid discipline. They looked down on their American guards, noting their loose uniforms, their chewing gum, and their casual relationships with officers. To the Prussian mindset, the Americans looked like an undisciplined mob. The Germans believed they were superior soldiers who had simply run out of supplies. They had no concept of the industrial titan waiting for them on the other side of the Atlantic. They believed the lie because they had never seen the truth. The gangplanks lowered at Newport News, Norfolk, and Boston, and the Afrika Korps stepped onto American soil. They marched down in perfect formation, boots striking the dock in rhythm, singing Panzerrollen in Afrika Korps. They were prisoners, yet they arrived as if they were an invading army on parade. This surreal spectacle, enemy combatants saluting the swastika on American docks while US military police looked on, marked the beginning of one of the strangest chapters of the war. The United States was unprepared for this invasion. The War Department had never planned to house a foreign army within its borders. In 1942, there were fewer than 100 German prisoners in the entire country. By the end of the war, there would be nearly 380,000. To accommodate this influx, the US Army Corps of Engineers embarked on a frantic construction program, reactivating old civilian conservation corps camps and building hundreds of new prisoner of war branch camps across the South and Midwest. The strategic logic shifted rapidly. Initially, the prisoners were seen as a security risk, a potential fifth column that might sabotage American infrastructure or incite riots. But as the draft stripped American farms and factories of able-bodied men, a desperate labor shortage emerged. The War Manpower Commission realized that the hundreds of thousands of healthy, disciplined men arriving from North Africa were not just a burden, they were a resource. Under the strict guidelines of the 1929 Geneva Convention, prisoners could be made to work, provided the tasks were not directly related to the war effort and were not dangerous. But before they could be sent to the cotton fields of Mississippi or the canning factories of Wisconsin, they had to be processed. The German soldiers were stripped, showered, and deloused, a standard military procedure that many indignantly compared to cattle processing. Their uniforms were returned, or replaced with American surplus, dyed dark blue, with the large letters PW stenciled in bright white paint across the back and pant legs. To the hardcore Nazis among them, this branding was an insult. To the weary conscript, it was merely a change of costume. The real psychological dismantling began the moment they left the processing centers. The prisoners expected to be marched to nearby holding pens or loaded into cattle cars, similar to how the Wehrmacht transported Soviet prisoners in the East, in cramped, freezing, and filthy boxcars with no ventilation or sanitation. Instead, they were directed toward passenger trains. In many cases, these were Pullman coaches, with upholstered seats, heating, and glass windows. The German officers, and even the enlisted men, were baffled. They asked their guards if this was a mistake. Why were prisoners being treated like tourists? The American guards, often bored and casual, simply shrugged. It wasn't a mistake. It was simply what was available. The US rail network was so robust and its rolling stock so plentiful that using passenger trains for prisoners was a matter of logistical convenience, not luxury. This was the first crack in the facade of their world view. A nation that could afford to transport its enemies in cushioned seats was a nation with resources the German mind could scarcely comprehend. As the engines fired up and the trains began to pull away from the coast, the prisoners pressed their faces against the glass. They were leaving the edge of the continent and heading into the heartland. They had been told America was weak. They were about to discover that it was vast beyond their imagination. The trains moved west, and the journey became an education in geography that no German schoolbook had ever provided. For a soldier raised in Europe, the concept of distance was defined by borders. A few hours' travel in any direction usually meant crossing a frontier, changing languages, or hitting a coastline. Germany itself is roughly the size of the US state of Montana. To the Wehrmacht soldier, the world was compact, dense, and finite. But the trains in America just kept moving. They chugged out of the eastern industrial corridors, through the rolling Appalachians, and onto the Great Plains. Hours turned into days, days turned into nights, and still they were in the United States. One prisoner, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, wrote in his diary about the terrifying realization of this scale. He noted that they had been traveling at full speed for 48 hours and had not yet seen a border guard. They passed through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri. The landscape shifted from forests to endless cornfields that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean. The psychological impact was suffocating. In Europe, they fought for every kilometre of ground. Here, they watched thousands of kilometres roll by, unoccupied and untouched. The vastness of the American interior whispered a terrifying truth. Even if the Wehrmacht somehow crossed the Atlantic, even if they took New York, they would simply be swallowed by the sheer emptiness of the continent. The strategic depth of the enemy was not just a line on a map, it was a physical reality that made their conquest in Europe look like skirmishes in a backyard. If the size of the land was sobering, what sat upon it was devastating. The prisoners remained glued to the windows, acting as involuntary spies gathering intelligence that would never reach Berlin. They saw the impossible volume of civilian automobiles. In Germany, private cars were a luxury, and by 1943, fuel was so scarce that even high-ranking officers used horses or bicycles. In America, they saw factory parking lots packed with thousands of worker vehicles. They saw highways clogged with trucks, not military convoys, but civilian logistics, moving goods with a casual abundance that seemed wasteful to the resource-starved Germans. They rolled past the rail yards of Chicago and St. Louis. They saw factories lit up at 3 a.m., glowing like cities unto themselves, smoke pouring from stacks, assembly lines churning out tractors and steel. Crucially, they saw what was missing. There were no blackout curtains. There were no bomb craters. There were no anti-aircraft batteries scanning the sky. The roofs were intact. The glass in the windows was whole. The propaganda had promised them a nation in ruins. Instead, they were witnessing a civilization operating at peak efficiency, completely immune to the war tearing Europe apart. One German officer, staring at a bustling Ford plant in the Midwest, reportedly turned to his captor and asked, "If this is the rear guard, where is the front?" He realized that the tanks and planes destroying his comrades in Russia and Italy were merely the overflow of this industrial juggernaut. The trains finally hissed to a halt in places like Aliceville, Alabama, Ruston, Louisiana, and Trinidad, Colorado. The prisoners disembarked, expecting the barbed wire and mud of a concentration camp. They found the wire, certainly, 10-foot fences topped with guard towers, But what lay inside shattered their expectations entirely. The most devastating weapon the United States deployed against the German mind was not a bomb, but a dinner plate. Upon entering the camp mess halls, the prisoners were handed metal trays and ushered into a chow line. They braced themselves for watery turnip soup or the hard, sawdust-filled war bread they had eaten in Europe. Instead, they were served the standard US Army garrison ration. The prisoners stared at their trays in disbelief. There were mounds of mashed potatoes swimming in butter. There were thick slabs of meat, pork chops, beef, chicken, portions that a German family would save for a wedding feast. There were vegetables, fruit, and endless cups of real coffee, not the bitter chicory substitute they had grown used to. But the item that caused the most confusion was the bread. It was soft, white, and sliced. Many prisoners initially refused to eat it, asking their guards why they were being served cake with their dinner. They could not conceive that a nation had enough wheat surplus to refine flour into pure white bread for its prisoners. They pocketed oranges and chocolate bars, hiding them in their bunks, convinced this was a trick or a one-time propaganda feast. But the feast happened again the next morning, and at lunch, and at dinner. The sheer caloric density of the American diet was so overwhelming that camp doctors reported prisoners gaining an average of 10 to 15 pounds in their first few months of captivity. Then there was the treatment. The United States, determined to protect its own soldiers held in Germany, adhered strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention. German officers were not required to work. They were given separate quarters, saluted by American enlisted men, and paid a stipend. The enlisted prisoners were housed in barracks that were heated in the winter, a luxury many had never known, even in their own homes. There were soccer fields, libraries stocked with books, and theatre groups. This created a profound cognitive dissonance. The Nazi indoctrination had painted the Americans as lawless, cultureless gangsters. Yet, these gangsters were following the rules of war more strictly than the Wehrmacht ever had. The golden cage, as the prisoners called it, was a psychological trap. If the enemy was this wealthy, this disciplined, and this humane, then everything the prisoners had been told was a lie. They weren't fighting against a collapsing society. They were fighting against a society so rich it could afford to treat its enemies like guests. And as the initial relief of safety wore off, a deeper, darker realization began to set in. Germany couldn't beat a country that threw away more food than the Reich could produce. By 1944, the war had followed the prisoners into the camps, but it was no longer a war of bullets. It was a war for the mind. Inside the barracks, a vicious struggle for control erupted. The hardcore Nazi officers and NCOs, often referred to as the Lager Gestapo, tried desperately to maintain the illusion of the Third Reich. They organized kangaroo courts in the dead of night, beating or even executing fellow prisoners who showed signs of defeatism or who spoke too fondly of the American lifestyle. They insisted that the final victory was imminent, that the V weapons were turning the tide, and that the abundance outside the wire was merely a localized trick. But the United States government had a counter-move that no amount of fanaticism could block. They opened the gates. Due to the severe labor shortage, the US Army began deploying POWs to work on local farms, harvesting cotton in Mississippi, corn in Illinois, and wheat in Kansas. This was the moment the ideological dam began to break. The German soldiers, many of whom were farmers' sons from Bavaria or Prussia, stepped onto American fields and stopped cold. In Germany, agriculture was still heavily reliant on draft animals. Horses and oxen pulled the plows. Harvest was often done by hand. It was back-breaking medieval labor. Here, they saw the future. They watched single American farmers operating massive international harvester combines and John Deere tractors, doing the work of 50 men in a single afternoon. They saw the mechanization of the food supply. One prisoner, working a harvest in the Midwest, wrote a letter home that was intercepted by sensors. He described the monsters of steel that crawled across the fields, harvesting grain faster than he could walk. He wrote, "We were told we were the master race, technologically superior to all, but here, a farmer's teenage son drives a machine that we do not even possess in the Wehrmacht." The humiliation was total. It wasn't that the Americans were better soldiers, it was that they didn't need to be. They had replaced the struggle of existence with gasoline and gears. The German soldier realized he was fighting a war of blood and grit against a nation of engineers and oil. The Lager Gestapo could threaten them in the barracks at night, but they couldn't explain away the tractors in the morning. The reality of American industrial superiority was eroding the Nazi myth, one harvest at a time. June 6, 1944. The news crackled over the radios in the camp canteens. The Allies had landed in France. For months, the prisoners had tracked the war on maps pinned to the barrack walls, moving pins to represent the front lines. The hardcore believers insisted the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable, that Rommel would drive the invaders into the sea within hours. But as the days turned into weeks and the pins moved steadily east toward the German border, a heavy silence descended on the mess halls. The invincible Wehrmacht was retreating. But the final crushing blow to the German psyche did not come from a map. It came from a projector. In the spring of 1945, as Allied troops liberated the concentration camps of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen, General Eisenhower ordered every atrocity to be filmed. He foresaw that the world, and the Germans themselves, would one day deny these crimes happened. The US War Department rapidly edited this footage into newsreels and mandatory documentaries. The order went out to the POW camps in America. Attendance was compulsory. The prisoners were marched into the camp theaters, expecting a Hollywood movie or a newsreel about the Pacific War. Instead, the lights dimmed and the screens filled with the grainy, nightmare footage of the Holocaust. They saw the piles of skeletal bodies being bulldozed into mass graves. They saw the gas chambers. They saw the faces of the survivors, hollowed out by starvation. The reaction in the theaters was visceral. Reports from Camp Aliceville and others describe a scene of total chaos. Some men vomited, others wept openly. Many shouted that it was a trick, a Hollywood fabrication, Jewish propaganda made with wax dolls. They covered their eyes, but the guards had orders to force them to watch. This was the breaking point. For years, they had told themselves they were honorable soldiers fighting for a noble cause, defending civilization against Bolshevism. They had clung to their dignity as warriors. Now, in the dark of an American cinema, that dignity was stripped away. They were forced to confront the reality that the industrial efficiency they had admired in American factories had been mirrored in Germany by an industrial assembly line of death. The 1,000-year Reich hadn't just lost the war, it had lost its soul. The cognitive dissonance that began with the lights of New York City ended here, in the flickering light of a projector. The German soldier realized he was not the victim of a tragedy, but the accomplice to a crime. The arrogance of 1943 was dead, replaced by a profound, hollow shame that would define a generation. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended. The guns fell silent, but for the 380,000 German prisoners in the United States, the gates did not immediately open. In a cruel twist of irony, the surrender of their government made them more valuable to their captors. With the war over, the Geneva Convention's restrictions on forced labour loosened. The United States, facing a massive backlog of agricultural and industrial work, delayed repatriation. For nearly another year, German soldiers continued to harvest American crops, their labour now fueling the post-war economic boom of the nation that had defeated them. But eventually, the ships returned. In 1946, the Liberty ships began the journey in reverse. The men boarding them were different from the arrogant soldiers who had arrived 3 years earlier. They spoke English with southern drawls or Midwestern twangs. They carried duffel bags packed with Hershey's chocolate, nylon stockings, and Camel cigarettes, items that were more valuable than gold in the wreckage of Europe. They expected to return to the fatherland they remembered. Instead, they stepped off the trains into Stunde Null, hour zero. The contrast was physically painful. They had spent the last years in the land of electricity, surplus, and obesity. They returned to a moonscape of rubble. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin were piles of brick and ash. The smell of death and wet masonry hung in the air. The reunion with their families was often a shock for both sides. The prisoners were tanned, healthy, and well-fed, bursting out of their uniforms. Their wives and children were gaunt, grey, and starving, having survived on less than 1,000 calories a day for years. The returning soldiers looked like aliens, biological proof of the American miracle. They were the healthiest men in Germany, fed by the enemy while their own leaders had let the nation starve. Many prisoners were not even sent home immediately. Tens of thousands were transferred to French and British custody to work as forced labourers clearing minefields and rebuilding infrastructure, a final, bitter humiliation. But those who did make it back to the ruins brought something with them more powerful than the chocolate in their bags. They brought the memory of how a free society functioned. The return of these men marked the beginning of a profound cultural shift that would define the second half of the 20th century. The United States had not just captured an army. Inadvertently, it had trained a new generation of German leadership. During the final months of captivity, the US War Department had launched a secretive initiative known as the Intellectual Diversion Program. The goal was to denazify the prisoners, not through force, but through exposure to democratic ideals. They were given civics lessons, access to uncensored American newspapers, and the freedom to debate without fear of the Gestapo. When these men returned to the rubble of the Reich, they didn't just bring back their physical health, they brought back a blueprint for reconstruction. Many former POWs rose to become mayors, teachers, judges, and captains of industry in the new West Germany. They had seen the alternative to totalitarianism, and they had seen it work on a scale that defied logic. When the Marshall Plan was announced in 1948, pouring billions of dollars into Western Europe, the German population might have been skeptical of American benevolence. But the hundreds of thousands of former prisoners knew better. They had tasted that benevolence in the chow lines of Alabama and Texas. They knew the Americans had the capacity to rebuild the world because they had seen the infinite factories that powered it. The lights of New York, which had once terrified them as a weapon of war, now became a beacon of alignment. The deep, almost unshakable bond between the Federal Republic of Germany and the United States was not forged in the boardrooms of diplomats. It was forged in the mess halls of the prisoner camps. The German soldier had gone to America believing he was fighting a degenerate enemy. He returned knowing he had met a superpower that conquered not just with fire, but with bread. The golden cage had done its job. It had turned the Wehrmacht's veterans into the foot soldiers of democracy. History often remembers World War II through its explosions, the thunder of Stalingrad, the roar of D-Day, the flash of Hiroshima. But for the men of the Afrika Korps, The decisive moment of the war was silent. It didn't happen on a battlefield, but on the deck of a transport ship, staring at a horizon that refused to be dark. The story of the German POWs in America is a testament to the ultimate brutality of logistics. The Third Reich was built on the concept of Wille, the belief that sheer will, courage, and racial purity could bend reality to its favor. They believed that a superior soldier could overcome superior odds. But when those soldiers looked at the incandescent skyline of Manhattan or the endless wheat fields of Kansas, they were confronted with a truth that no amount of propaganda could obscure. They realized that modern war is not a contest of will, it is a contest of physics. It is a mathematical equation of steel, oil, and calories. The United States didn't just outfight Germany, it outproduced, outfed, and outlighted them. The golden cage proved to be a more effective weapon than the dungeon. By treating the enemy with the casual abundance of a superpower, the United States didn't just break their bodies, it dismantled their ideology. In the end, the most terrifying sight a German soldier ever saw wasn't a tank or a bomber. It was the lights of New York City, burning bright and unafraid in the middle of a world war. A blinding demonstration that the enemy they had been sent to destroy was too big, too rich, and too powerful to even bother turning off the lights.